There are pivotal moments in our lives, aren't there? Those moments that happen that change the way we look at life, change the way we operate in life. I remember the birth of our firstborn child. That changed the way we live. That was a pivotal moment. When the last child moved away, that was another pivotal moment that changed the way we operate and changed the way we live our lives. In God's plan, His history of mankind, there have been pivotal moments that changed the way people operate and changed the way we understand God, changed the way that God relates with us. Obviously, one of the big ones was creation, when God created this world and created mankind and put us in the Garden of Eden. But the next pivotal moment was when Adam and Eve sinned against God. They wanted to go their way instead of trusting God. We see a couple chapters later in the book of Genesis that this next pivotal moment was when God destroyed all of life on the earth. He took the water, took the flood, and wiped them all out except for 8 souls. That was a defining moment of who God was and who we are and how we need to follow God. It changed the way that people operate. But of all the pivotal moments of God's history, it is the deliverance of God's people from Egyptian slavery. For 400 years, they had been slaves in Egypt, but with a mighty hand, God reached down and set them free from history. That was a defining moment of God until the cross. Until the cross and the crucifixion of Jesus. But those two acts, the release of freedom from slavery from Egypt and the release from slavery of sin, are tied closely together. God has been hailed from Passover to crucifixion as our deliverer. And so we look to Him in that way. It changes the way we understand God. When God sent the last plague on Egypt, when the Israelites were observing that first Passover meal, they rejoiced in the deliverance from slavery, but they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what God had in mind. When Jesus hung on the cross, with His last breath, He said, "It is finished." The greatest deliverance of all history had just happened. Jesus paid the price for our sin. We were set free from sin. But to what effect? The people didn't understand. And sometimes we have a hard time with that too. The crucifixion of Jesus, the death of Jesus on the cross, was the crowning moment, the crowning act of God's deliverance, because it finally met the righteous requirement of the law. That's what Matthew calls it. The righteous requirement of the law said, you keep the law perfectly or else you have to die. The wages of sin is death. And nobody could understand how God would ever take care of that because people always sinned. The prophets for ages and even the angels longed to look into what God was finally going to do to take care of the sin issue. They knew that we couldn't do it, but nobody could ever imagine that God would humble Himself and pay the price for us by dying on the cross for us. He lived a perfect life. He didn't have to die for us, but the great deliverer did just that. But to what? To what end? Now we're saved. The sins are taken away. What does that mean for us? It's fascinating. It was 40 years after God delivered the Egyptians, or delivered the Israelites from Egypt, that He finally brought them into the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that they had looked forward to, and God was faithful to His promise. When they went into that land, they gathered up 12 large stones from the shore, from the bed of the Jordan River, and they set up a large pillar to remind them of God's faithfulness and God's power. It was 3 days after Jesus died on the cross, after He was buried in that tomb, that He rose. And with His resurrection, He proved that He actually was who He said He was, the Son of God. And He showed that His promises would come true, and He showed that not only would He rise, but we would too. The Bible says He's the first fruits. We were the ones who will follow and be like Him. And so He promised us, I'll save you from your sin, I'll deliver you, so that you can have life like it was really meant to be. The Egyptians, or the Israelites, set up a pillar to remind them of deliverance. Every year, we observe Easter, we observe Resurrection Sunday to remind us of God's power and God's deliverance and God's purpose for us and the hope we have in the future of resurrection ourselves. Easter's not about colored eggs or bunnies or candy. Those are fun traditions, and do those if you will. They're fun, but don't ever let them hide the true meaning of Easter. And that's life. It is resurrection. Jesus rose from the dead, and he promised we would too. Live in that hope and that joy, that expectation. Have a great week.